saying there's a lot of repetition, hard to find something new. But Imperial is an original. I can promise you that. So I think you're in for something exciting. It's going to be, I think, a little bit focused on questions of empire and how to put it, the colonial worldview, and the question of identity, whether Ukraine has a history, is a place, deserves to be free. The answer is yes to all three of those questions, at least in my opinion, and I think you'll find that he shares those opinions. A long history, and certainly Russia, one important point to understand is that Russia is both a state and an empire. Soviet Union was a state and an empire, or sort of co-terminus. So we are talking about a kind of real ideology that's mixed into this Russian nationalism that's metastasized these days under Putin to something quite awful. The other point I just want to make is that the violence, I shared with my class here, senior seminar in international studies the other day, amazing book called Blood and Vengeance about the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, the civil wars in Bosnia. And I hadn't looked at the book for a while, but in reading it, it struck me how similar the tropes, the language, the discourse, the actions, the brutality, the violence there is to some extent what's going on in Ukraine today at the hands of Russian aggression. We can debate later in the discussion, whether this is aggression or not, and how to make peace, and who should make the first steps, and so on and so forth. But to my mind, there's no justification for the brutality, the slaughter, the unnecessary killing, not just of soldiers, but especially also of civilians in this world. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Daniel, for such a nice introduction. It could be used as a laudation at some ceremony. I'm really happy to be here, back to Texas, the place where I spent one semester as a Fulbright in mid-1990s. Long ago, in the past century, but still it's always pleasant to come to the native places in a way. And of course, I apologize for being late a little bit, because in Europe, I usually rely on my food and I am always on time. But here, Americans taught me to use cars, and it's very unreliable. It's terrible. Anyway, I'm going to talk about something called enigmatically imperial knowledge, and some other things, but imperial knowledge is a key term here. The term refers to a rather famous book by Eva Thompson under the same title, Imperial Knowledge, but basically it comes from Edward Said, it comes actually from Michel Foucault, but ultimately from Edward Said, who developed this concept of Orientalism as a Western way of control and manipulation of the Orient. In this case, of course, I'll be talking about Russian imperial knowledge, also as a way of control and manipulation of colonies. So let me start from the definition of the term. Too loud or too? All right. How to move it? Does anybody know how to move slides? Okay. Because my assumption is that imperial knowledge is in the core of today's problem. It caused a lot of troubles both for Ukraine and for entire world and for Europe and for Russia actually ultimately. So this is why I'd like to analyze and to press this. No, yeah. So what should I press? Oh, this. All right. Okay, thank you.
You have to put the mic very close to you.
Close?
No, closer.
Closer? So to better. Okay, all right, I'll try. I'll do my best. Okay, so I try to present the idea of imperial knowledge, this concept of imperial knowledge, and I defined it after Eva Thompson as a system of narratives aimed at silencing, undermining, and provincializing of subjugated nations, making them worthless and almost invisible on the international scene, insofar as the empire monopolized the authority to speak and act on their behalf. So, imperial knowledge is usually produced and disseminated by very powerful imperial institutions. It's distributed and exported through centuries. And of course, it strongly influenced Western media, Western academia, mass culture, and ultimately common wisdom. The problem is that as the world adopted and normalized that imperial knowledge. So there are many reasons for this uncritical acceptance of something imposed from the outside. I believe that the main reason is probably the imperial affinity of major Western powers, especially in the 18th, 19th centuries, when they were very susceptible to similar way of thinking, of worldview, of Weltanschauung. And this, and also political realism, which was dominant at the time, also contributed to this uncritical acceptance of the imperial knowledge. So, all these factors facilitated adoption of imperial knowledge, and transformation in something normal, something banal, something well known, something that is not to be questioned, not to be problematized, just because it's obvious, from the point of view of common wisdom. Why to problematize something that is normal? Why to problematize, for example, the term Kiev in Russia? It's nonsensical, basically. If you analyze this term, if you approach scientifically to this term, critically, you will find out that it's absolutely nonsensical. It's as nonsensical as to use ancient Romania instead of ancient Rome. Absolutely different entities. Well, they have something in common, but they are not the same. They cannot be equated. But because of dominance of this, Russian imperial knowledge, this terminology was accepted. Just, take a look at any textbook published in 1990, before 1990s. In 1990s, it began to change. But before that, all these textbooks by Rasanovsky and on, they wrote very seriously about Kiev and Russia, which, absolutely absurd, but this absurdity was taken for granted as a normal. So there are a lot of such examples. I'm not going to analyze all of them. It's many books can be published about this. But the ultimate result of this is that both Russia and its colonies, its dominions, their histories, their cultures, their societies, all this, their relations were seen, if at all seen, through the prism of that allegedly scientific knowledge. So, what are the consequences of this uncritical acceptance of imperial knowledge? Oh, first of all, I'm not going to talk about 19th century and so on, or early 20th century, but about recent years, recent decades, post-communist years. Well, first of all, it was failure to understand the Soviet Union as the empire, And therefore, to predict its collapse, it was absolutely shocking and unexpected event, and eventually to apply proper policies to all these new independent states which emerged after the Soviet Union dissolution. As a result of this, Western countries pursued Russia first policy, which was far harmful for all parties involved, both for the West and for Russia, and of course and especially for these new independent states, in particular for Ukraine, because they were absolutely marginalized and their relations with them were subordinated to the idea of Russia first, of Russian dominance, of Russian priority. So in case of Ukraine, all the relations with this country were constructed in a way that not to irritate Russia, not to harm Russia, not to provoke Russia. And of course, this, on one hand, it undermined Ukraine's development, Ukraine's prospects for European integration. Ukraine could not follow the same way as Romania, Bulgaria, and all these very similar Balkan states. On the other hand, it provided for Russia too much credits. It's probably assured Russian leaders that they are, they play special roles. They deserve special attention. They acquired too much self-confidence. I would say arrogance. This Western appeasement facilitated consolidation of dictatorship in Russia. Now we have to recognize this. Nobody dared to say this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but the process was obvious. For example, for me, it was clear that this policy of appeasement it played on the hands of the Kremlin leaders who consolidated authoritarian power. And today we have 100% totalitarian state, absolutely, unquestionably, very repressive. Ukraine, within this framework, was perceived as a highly corrupt, as dysfunctional, as almost failed state, and as very divided internally, as a wedge of collapse, as a wedge of split, or as a wedge of civil war. It's difficult to explain now why this country, who was so divided, so dysfunctional, why did it appear to be so resilient, so strong, actually, so well mobilized, so united in civic terms. This is a puzzle which cannot be explained. This question cannot be answered if we accept this previous idea about something was wrong with this description. And of course I have some hypothesis. I can explain what was wrong there, because for example the very idea of corruption, the very concept of corruption was highly overblown. Of course there is corruption, like in Italy, like elsewhere, in most countries, but this notion of corruption, index of corruption, is based on public opinion. Transparency International, the major institution which every year produces these international indexes, base this on public surveys. And of course, you have different answers from people depending on, first, how much information they have. Because in closed societies, this information is closed and not exposed. Ukraine is basically a free country and with free media, and they publish a lot about different corruption scandals. They have investigative journalists which exposes top officials. Actually, it's the topple-down former president Poroshenko. He lost elections just because he was very consequently and coherently attacked by investigative journalists. No, not himself, but his friends, his milieu. So this is one reason why this people's feeling about corruption can be overblown just because of information. It's mediatized. Secondly, Ukrainians usually they assess efficiency of their government, of their institutions, against the prospects for the European Union membership. So they have very high standards because Ukrainians' dream, Ukrainians' desire is to join European Union, to this club of a very prestigious club. And of course, they measure Ukrainian situation with this, gauge. They compare Ukraine with Germany, with Sweden, with these very highly developed countries. And of course, this also undermines their assessment of Ukrainian institutions. So there are some very serious reasons to have such assessment, which is not necessarily coincide with the reality. It exaggerates some phenomenon. You know? Also, I believe that we underestimate reforms which occurred in Ukraine since 2014, when, for example, decentralization, which played very important role, when local authorities got much more authority, much more power, and more money, which is also important. So they have a lot of initiatives. They are more self-sufficient. This might be one reason of Ukraine's Ukraine's resilience. But also we have to explain why this country, which was allegedly divided, was not split. On the contrary, it's united. Today, Ukrainians expose very strong civic identity, regardless of their ethnicity, language, whatever. Again, I'd like to emphasize that these notions were overemphasized. Because yes, all these features are divisive. They can be divisive in any society. There are a lot. It's rather easy to provoke discussions, debates, conflicts around these identity issues. But they are not priority for the people. If you range importance of these questions, they occupy like 22nd place, 25th place. So it's not something that is of paramount importance for people. You have to understand. And because of this, it's not so easy to mobilize people again around such issues. So to sum up, I would say that Ukrainian society, in fact, it was fragmented but not divided. That's a difference. And I'd like you to understand this. Fragmentation is not the same as division. Bosnia is divided. That's a very good example of divided country. Ukraine is not divided. You cannot find any clear lines which divide people. People communicate regardless of their language, ethnicity, religion, whatever. It's not divisive. It's fragments. It's factor of fragmentation. Yes, it's another matter. But when all these differences became absolutely unimportant in situation of external aggression. This is like extended family. You may discuss, you may quarrel, you may fight sometimes, but if any outsider tries to interfere, to intervene, and to give you advices how to settle your family affairs, people usually unite, rally around the flag. Yes. So it's quite a typical phenomenon, and for me it was little surprise that Ukrainians behaved as they behaved. But nonetheless, even though all this imperial knowledge was largely compromised and in many cases questioned, is being questioned, but still we have a lot of remnants of this knowledge and consequences of this knowledge, because all the time we hear from different corners advices of very wise people who say that maybe you have to negotiate, maybe you have to make some peace with Mr. Putin, maybe not to humiliate him, maybe to spare his face, and so on, so on. It's very nice advices. I believe that many people do this in good faith, not necessarily on being hired by Kremlin or so on. But I would argue that these advices are naive at best. At worst, they are perfidious. And I'll try to explain why. Well, this cartoon I recently found in a Polish journal, which laughed at the consistent calls from Mr. Scholz and from Mr. Macron to Mr. Putin. They also tried not today, but it was in the summer, in May and June, when they still tried to persuade him to make sort of peace or armistice or whatever. This is how Polish cartoonists see the situation. But I'm going to argue that all these advices are senseless, and I mentioned already they are naive at best, because they fundamentally expose fundamental misunderstanding of what Russia is, and what kind of war it is pursued in Ukraine. They also don't understand why Ukraine resists and why Ukraine is so defiant. They don't understand that Ukraine basically wages war of national liberation, the colonial war. War which was, national liberation which was not fully completed back in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Because at the time, Ukraine tacitly accepted kind of neo-colonial relations with Moscow, which were largely facilitated by Western policy, Western recognition of Russian sphere of influence, recognition of this post-Soviet space as Russian legitimate sphere. So we have to understand that, today's war is not a war about territory. Territory is not the most important thing. If it was about territory, yes, we could negotiate. It's not the main problem. This war about identity. It's war about freedom, about dignity, and about very existence of Ukraine as a nation. Because if you read carefully statements of Mr. Putin, of all his lieutenants, you would find out that they deny the very existence of Ukraine. Ukraine does not exist from their point of view and should not exist. So, their intent is either to convert Ukrainians back into Russians, because they have this very strange idea that Ukrainians are Russians who simply lost their memory, lost their consciousness, and they should be forcibly turned back into Russians. Somebody comes to you and say, you are not John, you are Mary, and you should become Mary because you have wrong consciousness, you have wrong ideas that you are John. No, identity is identity. Nobody can decide instead of the people, on behalf of the person who you are. It's up to you. It's up to Ukrainians to decide who they are. All these historical arguments do not matter. Of course, they also can be easily disproved because all these historical arguments are quasi-historical. They have nothing to do with real history. But it doesn't matter. Even if they were true, they are irrelevant in this situation because it's up to Ukrainians to decide who they are, what kind of nations they are. But Moscow wants to, the main idea is to turn them back into Russians. And if they resist, if they don't want to, they are nationalists, they are Nazis. They should be exterminated. This is what they openly say. Just, read RIA Novosti, read all this publicists, watch Russian TV, how they discuss Ukrainian issues. This absolutely genocidal approach. And what is to be done? Ukrainians have to fight. They have no other choice. They have no other option, either to perish or to resist as long, as much as possible. And this attitude predominates. If you take a look at opinion surveys, if you negotiate to talk to the people, and I visit from time to time Ukraine, I have this first-hand communication. People are determined to resist. I haven't meant recently. I've been to Kiev during this terrible missile strikes when all the electricity was destroyed and out. Nobody. I haven't met a single person who would say that no, we have to compromise. We have to give up. We have to make some peace with Putin. They understand it's impossible. Russia would not stop. The main goal is either to subordinate Ukraine, to absorb Ukraine, or to destroy it. So it's not about, even if they, because of some crisis, because of some failures, promote some sort of armistice, it wouldn't last long. They resume, they accumulate some force, they accumulate some power, and they would resume this. Actually, we had the armistice since 2014. It was kind of armistice. They got what they wished. They got Crimea. They got some part of Donbass. They were not happy. They were not satisfied. They provoked all the time new conflicts. So it's impossible. And I would say that Ukrainians have good chances to win, from my point of view, because throughout all the history, all the colonial wars are lost by the empires. I don't know any case when colonial wars were successful. Sooner or later, colonial people, they acquire independence, full independence. They get rid of colonial dominance. And in this case, I also would like to assure you that nuclear power would not help in this case. Ukrainians are not going to encircle Moscow, to take Moscow. So, for Ukrainians, victory means only just to liberate their own occupied territories, nothing else. Ukrainians are not going to invade Russia and are not going to attack Russia. From Ukrainian point of view, victory means just, liberation of their own country and efficient, effective protection of their territory. So building up of strong army, developing good industry, and so on, so on. And of course, carrying out reforms and many more, but not to invade Russia. So there is no reason for Russia actually, to use nuclear arms as a last resort. Because I can imagine, of course, this dramatic situation when Moscow is encircled by some, enemies and they have nothing left, nothing to do, and so on. It's a very hypothetical question, but my point here is that we should not give up to this blackmail, because if once we do this, we would encourage both the same rogue state and many other rogue states to apply the same tactics, to apply the same methods to blackmail, to achieve more and more by blackmail. So you have to definitely say no, because otherwise this story would repeat and repeat and repeat endlessly. So that's so much. And personally, I don't believe in these threats. It largely depends, of course, on communication, especially this undercover communication between Kremlin and Western powers. It depends on the signals that Mr. Putin may get from NATO, from Washington. That consequences would be very serious. It should be communicated very clearly, not like in January this year when Mr. Biden said openly that we are not going to interfere. I understand, and of course I approve his decision. He was right probably not to interfere. He had legitimate right not to interfere. But why to say this? Why to say this? Why to state this openly? The enemy should not know your intentions, whether you interfere or not. He did it. So it was, from political point of view, it was very strange decision, for professional politician who disclosed his cards in advance. In Moscow, it was perceived as a green light. Oh, they're not going to interfere, so go ahead. That's regretfully. Anyway, to come to the end. So I very critically express my very critical view on this peace prospects, which are promoted by some very serious, actually, political analysts and politicians. My argument is that, as long as Ukraine is fighting for its very existence, and Ukrainians know what happens on occupied territories, how they know a lot about Russian brutality, about mass killings, about rapes, and all these things. Just read stories in the media. So as long as Ukrainians are aware of this existential threat, and as long as Russian regime is preoccupied with final solution of so-called Ukrainian question, all these calls for peace are very, very naive. And here I found very interesting analogy from the 1930s. I found publication in the New York Times in 1934, when very similar West American pundits called Jews not to resist, to make some peace with Hitler, because maybe he's not so bad. Maybe maybe you can explain him, your point of view, your reasons. And here's quotation from New York Times. I can show you eventually also screenshot. This very, 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 very interesting quotation, which can be actually, reformulated today about Mr. Putin and Ukraine. Just, replace Hitler with Putin and replace Jews with Ukrainians, and you would have the same very, very topical today's article. By hating Hitler and trying to fight back, Jews are only increasing the severity of his policies against them. Yes, Ukrainians provoked Putin and he is sending rockets, missiles to him. If Jews throughout the world try to instill into the minds of Hitler and his supporters recognition of the ideas for which the race stands, and if Jews appeal to the German sense of justice and German national consciousness, I'm sure the problem will be solved more effectively and earlier than otherwise. And Here's a screenshot from this. It's accessible. You can go into archive of New York Times and to find these articles from 1934. So you understand my skepticism with all these advices about peacemaking. For me, it's crystal clear that under today's circumstances, all these calls to stop the war should be reformulated as to stop Putin, stop Russia. Otherwise, they would mean nothing else but to stop Ukraine's resistance. If you want this, yeah, say this clearly. Not use euphemism like, you know, stop the war. Either stop Russia, stop Putin, or stop Ukraine's resistance. There are no other options. And this is the only possible way to arm Ukraine, to support Ukraine, to at least until Ukraine's territory is liberated. And of course, what is very needed today, I believe, more and more sanctions. I believe this rogue regime should be completely isolated, completely, thoroughly. This is the only way to bring it to collapse. So far, you know, my feeling is that Ukraine looks like lightweight boxer who fights with a heavyweighter. And even worse, it's a lightweight boxer who has one hand tied because it cannot use heavy weapon, cannot use aircrafts, and so on. So it's very, very difficult, very unequal, I would say, fight. But nonetheless, Ukraine has quite high moral because they understand that what they are fighting for. Russian soldiers typically don't understand. Most of them don't understand what they are doing in Ukraine. So to sum up, I'd like to mention also that there is one more factor which makes Ukrainian resistance uniquely important, not only for Ukrainians, but also for the entire humankind. It's war of fledgling democracy against post-Soviet totalitarian dictatorship. It's clash of values, of principles, and in fact, of civilizations. More precisely, it's clash of European civilization with post-Soviet totalitarian dictatorship. So in this way, as and Applebaum argued, victory for Ukraine will really be a victory for all who believe in democracy and the rule of law, and vice versa. Victory for Russia would be a victory for all those who believe that strength matters and that myths prevail over facts. So much about prospects. I'm not a prophet, but I promised you to derive some lessons from this so-called conflict, which is not conflict, it's real war. I feel that first of all, we should get rid of political realism for both moral and practical reasons. First, because this approach leads us back to politics as fighting of all with all, as to lead us back to 19th century, to this politics as jungle where might makes right and only force, real force apply, no rules apply. Also, we have to read this of political realism because it does not make world more stable. This is practical reasons. Besides moral concerns, it's also practically is not efficient. It does not provide real stability to the world. Even if you divide the world for sphere of influences, there are a lot of small players who would disagree. They also have agency, and they don't want to belong to this or that sphere of influence. You may assign them to some sphere of influence, but they would not agree with this, and they all the time would rebel, they would protest. There would be still a lot of instability because of this. Actually, there was kind of settlement after Yalta during the Cold War, and still, these countries, these nations, East European nations, they had their own agency and they fought, they resisted. Ultimately, they brought down communist regime to kneel. So we have to get rid of this approach, which is absolutely unacceptable on moral ground and on practical ground. We have to understand that political actors are not always rational, because political realism is based on the idea of rationality. No, they are not always rational. Hitler was not rational when he was preoccupied with Jewish question, and Putin is not rational when he's preoccupied with Ukraine question, because both of them believe that these nations are some kind of threat to their own nation. Of course not. Of course it's irrational. And as I mentioned already, much of today's troubles with Russia came from uncritical appropriation of imperial knowledge. So this imperial knowledge has to be deconstructed. It had to be revised, analyzed, and dismantled. So this is our goal in academia. We have to do this job. We have to revise all these textbooks, all these programs, syllabuses, curriculums, because all of them are infected, very heavily infected by imperial knowledge. All this, model of history is absolutely perverse and very far, very remote from reality. There are more and more very good texts published now, but they still are not in the mainstream. That's the problem. We have to reconsider this. So I would rather stop here. I have more materials, and maybe during discussion I would show you some more data and provide more arguments. So far, yes, I stop here. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. That was very, very keenly presented, I would say. And I will go back and revise my syllabus. Though I would already say I already have, because I was fortunate to have been taught by someone who never accepted the Russian version of East Slavic history. So I consider myself fortunate in that. And I try to pass that on to the students.
Guilty.
Anyway, questions, please. There's so much to talk about. Yes.
Very good question. I'd like to know myself. What can I speculate on? First of all, I don't believe at the moment in any democratic replacement. It's very unlikely. In today's Russia, you have really totalitarian regime, and what we can expect in totalitarian regime, some emergence of some person like Khrushchev after Stalin or Gorbachev after Brezhnev. This is most reliable scenario. So somebody from the regime, from within the regime, emerges who is more rational. So it's the same. There are the same people, but with more rational thought. People who are more adopted to the contemporary world, who understands that Putin leads Russia to nowhere. It's dead. It's deadlock. This is most likely scenario. Some kind of revisionism appears. This is actually what happened in the last last months of Nazi Germany. It was also totalitarian state, and all the people and all the elite supported Hitler as long as he was winning. But when he began to lose, all kinds of conspiracies began. Top militaries conspired against him unsuccessfully, but basically it what happened. So I predict that from my point of view, this war would last long. It would not be over in probably next year. Probably not. It's war of attrition indeed, but it results in more and more casualties on the Russian side, more and more losses, and economic sanctions do work. They do not work so fast as we would like to, but they work. Isolation is important. Everything is important. So all these things lead to delegitimization of the regime. We already observed that Putin himself is less and less popular in the country. So this undermines legitimacy, and ultimately it leads to some sort of defection within the ruling elite. So this is what we can expect, but of course it largely depends on Ukraine's successes or on Ukraine's resilience, resistance, so much. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Why do you think Zelensky was elected president? And did he surprise the people themselves on his strength of character?
Well, Zelensky was elected, first of all, because of very good public relations, very good campaign, electoral campaign. He was elected maybe not as Zelensky, but as a hero of his series, very popular TV program under the title The Servant of the People. He plays the role of president there. So he elected maybe not Zelensky, but the hero of that TV series. Yes, but I believe that, anybody who is elected to this position has to play the role of the president anyway. I strongly recommend you, if you can find a classical film by Rossellini, General della Rovere. A film from 1958, which won a Golden Lion in Venice. It's a really very good film. It's a classical film, which explains this psychological transformation of the hero, who from nobody is transformed into real hero. I recommend you. I believe it's it's old. It's classical film. It can be easily found anywhere. Zelensky was elected on anti-corruption platform, which is quite reasonable because Ukraine, as I mentioned, is open society. Ukraine has free press, and Poroshenko did not meet expectations of Euromaidan revolution. People were disappointed, as I usually are. So of course it was a kind of protest vote against Poroshenko, who did not fulfill expectations, but also vote for the hero of this film TV series. And he, from the very beginning, he was rather apolitical person. He sincerely wanted to make some sort of peace with Putin. He made a lot of gestures into this direction, but it appeared impossible. He discovered something that all post-Soviet leaders discovered sooner or later, that Russia does not need any friendship, any good relations. Russia needs full subordination, full vassalitet. Something like relations of kind of with Lukashenko. This is okay. This is what Moscow accepts. If you have another Lukashenko in Ukraine, probably it would be possible. But Ukrainians don't want Lukashenko. That's the problem. Ukrainians used to live for 30 years in more or less free country. There was an attempt to make it less free under Yanukovych, and Ukrainians protested. Ukraine staged 2 revolutions only because there was an attempt to derail Ukraine from democratic development. Both revolutions were actually a response to some authoritarian tendencies, to some attempts to limit, to restrict freedoms, and so on. So what many people don't understand, another result of imperial knowledge, which promotes the idea of similarity, of affinity, Ukraine and Russia. They accept this idea uncritically, but they fail to understand that Ukraine and Russia until the 17th century had nothing in common. They belong to absolutely different worlds. They had something in common maybe in Middle Ages, but in Middle Ages, it was 10th century or 11th century. But after that, Muscovy, not Russia, it was Muscovy. It became Russia only under Peter the Great in the early 18th century. Muscovy evolved under auspices of Golden Horde, of Mongol Tatar Empire, with all consequences of this belonging. It was despotic state, yeah. Ukraine developed, Ukraine and Belarus at the time, yeah, because it was a single country at the time, or so-called Ruthenia. It evolved within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was aristocratic republic with ideas of limitation of power, with elected king, with contract relations between rulers and subjects. It's absolutely different political culture. And this is the main difference between Ukraine and Russia, absolutely different political culture. Of course, also there is languages are not so proximate as many people believe. Russian is for Ukrainians is only Russian for Ukrainians is only 4th closest language. Belarusian is the closest; it's 90% the same. The second is Polish. The third is Slovak, and Russian is only 4th because of very heavy Bulgarian influence via Czech Slavonic. That's another philological matter. Religion, it also seems to be the same because most Ukrainians are Orthodox. But again, Orthodoxy in Ukraine and in Russia are absolutely different churches. Because in Russia, traditionally, Orthodox Church was part of the state. It was completely etatized. Its state institution had been and is. in Ukraine, church never was etatized. In Ukraine, Orthodox Church was actually oppositional church because it was in Catholic state. In Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was Catholic. So Ukraine Orthodoxy played a role of sort of Protestantism, yeah, because it was vis-a-vis. They had to compete with Catholics. They had to learn. They had to read books. They had to participate in different debates. It was part of civil society, and still is. If you take a look at today's role of Orthodox Church in Ukraine, it's not part of the state. It's independent, really independent institution. It's civic institution. So there are a lot of differences, and of course we have to understand this to reject this imperial knowledge. Yes. Yes. Mm. Yes. 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 Well, it's a very good question. I dare to say that the only future Russia has its future without Ukraine. Only in this case, Russia can become really efficient, democratic, normal nation state. Otherwise, it would still be, terrorized by its own demons of imperial greatness and a kind of schizophrenia. So the only way to cure Russia is to end these dreams about Ukraine forever. I understand it's very difficult, it's problematic, because Ukraine is a part of Russian identity. It's very pervasive, but it's true. Russian identity was constructed not just with including Ukraine. It was based on Ukraine. It was based on this idea of continuity from Kiev, which was mythical continuity, of course, because until the 17th century, it was worlds apart. Moscow was Moscow. It had no connections to Kiev at the time. So for them, of course, I understand that it's a very painful process, because without Ukraine, they have a big, dark, black hole in their identity. So they feel kind of pain because of this. But they have to change this, because otherwise the country cannot become normal country, because all the time they would place their center, their identity on some some fictional place. They will not be able to adopt modern values, because they still this identity, Russian imperial identity, is based on medieval values. It still draws them back to Middle Ages, draws them to this so-called traditionalism, which is obscurantism. In fact, it's a huge obstacle for modernization of the country, I would say. You cannot modernize the country as long as you attach identity of this nation to some mythical world which does not exist today, which existed, maybe existed some, a few hundred years ago. So it pulls Russia back into Middle Ages, and it's very, very problematic issue. So this is why I argue that, the only way to liberate Russia is just, to liberate Ukraine from Russia. Mm. Yes.
Most of them.
Yeah.
What's the condition leftover space infrastructure in Ukraine? Is it a factor at all? China has just put up their space station. They're very aggressive in our space.
Mm-hmm.
We created a space force.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't exaggerate the importance of Ukraine as as some economic base resources or this enterprises. They played some role, but they are not irreplaceable, and Russia has its own chain of production. So basically, they learned how to live without Ukraine. At least with the past 8 years, Ukraine and Russia diverged completely, and the relations were very limited, and trade was minimal. So they became largely independent from each other economically. This relations, these ties were broken, and to the benefit of both sides, I believe, because economies became more competitive.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Not really. I'm afraid that not, because yeah, we can compare, of course, this potential of conflict in both cases, but I don't think that Taiwan plays such an important role for China. It may play a role. It may be important for China, for communist China, in some from the imperial point of view, as another the territory, as a precedent of some rebellious province which separated. But Taiwan did not play symbolical role. Taiwan is not in the center of China's identity. Ukraine is. Ukraine and Kyiv is in the very center of Russian identity. So it's very exceptional case. I cannot find any comparison in the. I don't know any similar situation when some country constructed its national or imperial identity on the foreign capital, foreign city, on foreign nation. It's very unique situation. It's very dramatic, of course, because of this. Very dramatic.
Yes, sir.
Russian Orthodox Church is instrument of Kremlin. They fully identify themselves with Moscow. They support this genocidal war. They bless Russian military. They directly say that you have to fight and you go to the heaven because it's righteous war, and so on, so on. So it's absolutely. This is actually a reason why the branch of Russian Church in Ukraine separated now. So we used to have two different churches since independence. We had Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kyiv Patriarchate and Moscow Patriarchate, which was subordinated to Moscow. After the war, they broke. They couldn't follow this Moscow line, even though they were quite pro-Moscow traditionally.
Okay, one more.
Yes. Well, of course, this would result in very serious crisis in Russia. As I understand, Ukrainians' program minimum in this war is to liberate territories which were occupied since February. So, besides, except for Crimea and this, part of Donbass, and program maximum is to liberate all the territories which were occupied in 2014. So. If they achieve this minimum goal, they can negotiate about the maximum goal. So this Crimea and Donbass can be negotiable, but these newly occupied territories of Zaporizhia, of Kherson, are non-negotiable. It's absolutely unacceptable. This is how I understand Zelensky's statements and so on. Of course, any Russian defeat would result in a very serious crisis in Moscow. Of course, neither Putin nor his closest circle can recognize this and can accept this, because they invested too much in this war. They have no way back. That's unfortunate situation. They cannot retreat. The only hope is for regime change. Either it would be natural, it can be, or forcible. I don't know. But we can expect emergence of some more pragmatic leaders who understand that this war has no prospects. As all colonial wars, they have no prospects, either in Vietnam or Afghanistan or whatever. And secondly, who understands that the only way for Russia to come back into the international scene is to get rid of all these things, to condemn actually this, to recognize this as a mistake. And this, by the way, this also should be very clear signal from the West that armistice is not enough. You have completely to pay off for this. If you want to come back, if you want sanctions to be removed, and so on. This signal also had to be sent. And in this case, I believe that sooner or later there, within the Russian ruling elite, some people would emerge who came to understand this and who would try to somehow to settle the issue, because it's not very comfortable to live as a pariah state, and most of these people had been integrated into international tourist industry and so on. They are accustomed to Dolce Vita, maybe not them personally, but their relatives, their children, their friends, their girlfriends. And so on. They used to have very, very nice villas in France, in Italy, in Switzerland, and suddenly everything is closed. So I believe that there should be some groups that would like to revise this policy to get rid of Putin. But of course, as long as they have this crazy Führer, they cannot do anything. That's a bottleneck.
Just this morning, I read on Johnson's Russian list, which is a source of disinformation.
Yeah, it's very
enormous numbers of commentators, academics, realists, political scientists, as he was talking about, who are again clamoring for peace negotiations.
Yes, I know.
Selling out Ukraine in the sense of their agency doesn't matter. They're obstinate and in the way. We've got to solve this with Russia. They don't matter. And will that voice prevail after the elections next week?
I'm not that pessimistic. Of course, Johnson's list is very, very, very special thing, and it's a byproduct of freedom of speech, so to say. American. The only problem is that it's published under the auspices of George Washington University. That's the problem. Because otherwise,
how is that?
It's a problem because it gentrifies this very dubious publication. But anyway, yes, it gives credits. But regarding, I still believe in American bipartisan support. It can be matter of some, speculations. Can be matter of some electoral gains. But generally, American political class should understand some, strategic interest and strategic values. I'd like to believe it, In any case, Ukrainians are determined to resist. So they have to recognize this. Because all this, all these realist calculations are miscalculations. They divided the world in Yalta in 1945. And they established these spheres of influence. And they maintained this cold peace for years, for decades. But still, still it was not settlement. Still, these nations whose fate was decided in Yalta, they resisted, they rebelled. And in 1989, they won. And the same would be here, you cannot decide on behalf of other people because they also have agency. So you can sell them out for years, for decades, but still they would resist. They still would rebel. They still this order would not be stable anyway, as it was not actually. After Yalta, all the time there were some protests and some rebellions in communist bloc. Either in Hungary or in Czechoslovakia or in Poland, these people did not want to accept.
It's the first lesson of history. It's about change. Ukraine today different from Ukraine in 1989.
Yes.
91.
Yes, of
It's
course.
grown, it's developed.
Yes, yes, of course.
It's something more than just a failed state. And I'm going to be quiet. But
Absolutely.
thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Oh, that's very good. That's very nice picture. It's about well, it's not our fault. It's not our
It's not completely divided here.
fault.
And I have something.